Good morning, everybody. We're just giving people a couple of minutes to arrive before we kick off. We'll give people maybe 2 minutes before we start this session. Okay, just got 1 more minute and then we're just going to we still have got people coming in. We've now got 26 participants, so just give it 1 more minute and we'll kick off. Okay, well, I think we'll get started. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third keynote session. I know I'm a bit biased because I'm one of the conference organisers, but I think it's been a really stimulating conference so far, and I'm very excited about this third keynote session where we're going to be hearing from Predrag Cvetičanin. Just a couple of quick notes before we kick off, just to remind you that after the keynote has finished, which is going to be around 50 minutes, please raise your hands if you have any questions. Secondarily, if you prefer to put something in the chat function, Vava and Sophia will be checking the chat function, so they'll be able to relate any questions for the keynote speaker. And just one other point in case I forget it later on, that after this session, so we've got an hour and a quarter now, and after this session that the lunch room will be open for you to join for an informal chat. Okay, so I'm very excited and very pleased to welcome Predrag Cvetičanin to speak to us today. And he's going to be talking about classes and culture wars in Serbia. So Predrag graduated in sociology at the University of Nice, where he teaches now. He majored in the sociology of arts, but he's worked at a number of other places. In the meantime, he's got no less than 3 master's degrees, including from the University of Belgrade and the London School of Economics, and he defended his PhD thesis in the sociology of culture at the University of Belgrade. And then he's worked at a number of places, and including being a lecturer at the UNESCO Department of Cultural Policies and Cultural Management at Belgrade, at the University of Arts. And he is also the head of the Centre for Empirical Cultural Studies of Southeast Europe, which is a centre, an independent research institute that's been going since 2010, which cooperates with a large number of researchers in Southeast Europe, but also around the world, includes sociologists, psychologists, linguists, statisticians, and cultural managers. And as part of this institute, Predrag has played a key role in a number of major research projects, including life strategies and survivals of individuals and households in Southeast Europe during the time of economic crisis, out of the margins, and differentiation of cultural manifestations of the aim of developing cultural tourism. Predrag has written and edited 12 books in the course of his career so far, including A Life for Tomorrow, Social Transformations in Southeast Europe, Differentiation of Cultural Manifestations with the aim of developing cultural tourism, Us and Them, Symbolic Divisions in Western Balkan Societies, Social and Cultural Capital in Western Balkan Societies, and Social and Cultural Capital in Serbia, where he was one of the editors. And he's had he's had considerable influence in the field, and has also published a number of influential journal articles, including one that's been particularly influential in the field, The Art of Making Classes in Serbia, which was published in Poetics. So it's my great honor to, and also I should point out that Predrag is a key member of the board of the Sociology of Culture Research Network, and a very active member and valued member of the board. So I'd like to welcome Predrag to commence with his keynote on classes and wars, on classes and culture wars in Serbia.
Simon, thank you very much. I'm really honored and grateful for the opportunity to speak at this conference. And I will speak about relation between collective symbolic cleavages which generate culture wars and class divisions in Serbia. And there will be two parts of my talk. The first one, I'll briefly try to present a model to analyze class structure in hybrid post-socialist societies in Southeast Europe, which I developed with my colleagues from Croatia and UK/Chile. And the hybridity of these Southeast European societies results from their being between two worlds. They're bearing clear marks of their socialist past on one hand, and on the other hand, having been exposed to intensive neoliberal transformation over the last 30 years. Our starting point is related to Pierre Bourdieu's lecture in 1989 in Berlin, November 1989, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, in which he stated that in socialist societies, there are different moments which differentiate and generate social inequalities than post-industrial societies that he studied, and that everybody knows, I guess, that according to Bourdieu, economic and cultural capital are the main capitals in advanced post-industrial societies. But in socialist societies, key capitals are political capital, social capital, and cultural capital was the main oppositional capital. So the unwritten rule for socialist societies was that if you want to get access to resources and services, you need to have informal connections. And they are used for a variety of purposes: to ensure goods and services in short supply, to find work, to secure promotions, to sidestep formal procedures. And they usually have special names for this, like Blat in Russia or Guanji in China, Zawovic Sprav in Poland, Stela in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And basis for these informal connections were different: party membership, but also can be kinship, common geographic origin, ethnicity, religion, and so on. And we identified two types of social capital, both in socialism and post-socialism, which we called social capital of informal connections and social capital of solidarity. It looks like a common division between bridging and bonding social capital, but it's different. Social capital of informal connections basically serves to do social closure. You monopolize access to goods and resources using social capital of informal connections. And this social capital of solidarity is very much close. It refers to close networks of relatives and friends that can offer you some help or borrow money, especially to those who are desperately poor, who has no other capitals at their disposal. And when it comes to political capital, which is also very active in socialist societies and post-socialist societies as a key resource, we redefine it in contrast to Bourdieu, who defines political capital as a subspecies of symbolic capital. a sort of trust that voters have for their representatives. We define political capital as the ability to use and misuse state and public resources and institutions. Political capital is the strongest capital, but at the same time, the least stable one. In contrast to, for example, economic capital, which is more or less stable, you can lose political capital in a day. So it pushes those holders of the political capital into two types of strategies. One of them is to basically loot public resources, to steal them in a very short period and transform their political capital into an economic capital, or to try to find a way to stabilize political capital through mechanisms which we call society capture. The major change in post-socialist transformation was the rise of importance of cultural capital, of economic capital, excuse me. Economic capital has been continuously gaining strength due to complete change to market economy and increase internationalization, change legislation, and the active role of governments in the region in adopting and promoting neoliberal agenda. Cultural capital has lost part of its strength and its oppositional character, but being largely turned into a simple resource. And political and social capital continue to function as a very important sources of social differentiation. Post-socialist societies of Southeast Europe are hybrid in many senses, but the key one is the fact that in them, social inequalities are generated by two mechanisms or several mechanisms of similar strength, which we called exploitative market mechanisms based on economic capital. These are the ones which became prominent with the neoliberal transformation of these societies, and different types of social closure mechanisms based on political and social capital. What we call exploitative market mechanisms, they evolved from change or privatized ownership structure of the economy, and especially by the constant legal reduction of workers' rights and benefits. Also, one of the things which in a way lead to exploitative market mechanisms is this fourth phase in which many of these societies are in what is real post-socialist transformation. It's called race to the bottom. It refers to the situation when governments in the region are so desperate to attract investors that they basically offer them any kind of benefits, including unbelievably cheap labor laws. And this reduction of workers' rights, which represent part of this neoliberal transformation, can be seen in these three aspects, basically. In steady reduction of labor law rights in Serbia, especially since 2014. Then two is particularly important in limiting the scope of those who are entitled to these rights. Namely, in Serbia, only those who are permanently employed are entitled to these rights, which means that about from 30 to 40% who work in temporary jobs they are not entitled to these rights. And finally, there is de facto breaching of even such drastically reduced rights in practice. For those of you who don't live in Eastern Europe, probably it would be unbelievable how these companies treat workers. We have hundreds of testimonies from media reports or from our own semi-structured interviews, and about, for example, workers who are forced to wear diapers on the production line, or women who have to wear red ribbons around their arms when they're menstruating, so that line managers can see first who is going to the toilet more often, and secondly, to monitor if some of these young girls got pregnant, so they can dismiss them before they can ask for pregnancy leave. There are reports on those who are dismissed because they got terminally ill, or for example, those who got dismissed because they participated in perfectly legal strikes or they attempted to unionize. So this reduction of workers' rights enables those who have economic capital, mostly these foreign companies, to hire workers in temporary, in part-time jobs. Most of them work in 3 months contract to 6 months contracts and so on. That there is a huge increase in workload and unpaid working hours and non-payment of benefits. There are reports that they work on Saturdays, Sundays. They cannot complain. They simply afraid to complain because they might lose their job. It's not the practice of foreign companies, but many local companies not register employees at all. So it's a black market work, and it implies the almost complete absence of any rights. And I mentioned these unfair and unlawful dismissals, but most importantly of all this is that this enables enormous generation of profits and wealth in ridiculously short time. These social closure mechanisms these exploitative mechanisms mostly deprive those who work in industrial and service sector, and also those who work in temporary jobs, ranging from agrarian work to creative industries. But these social closure mechanisms in Southeast European societies have much wider scope of application. And there are several different types of these social closure mechanisms. Most of them were present in socialism as well. The strongest one is membership in political parties. And in the period of socialism, in Yugoslavia at least, if you want to have managerial jobs or executive jobs, then you had to be a member of the Communist Party. But if you want to be a kindergarten nurse or a teacher or an engineer, that was not the case. Today, for almost each post, it really counts whether you're a political party member and of which party. Also, there are influences of social networks based on kinship, common geographic origin and informal interest group, then ethnicity, religion, and gender. All of these are informal. So you cannot find any trace that it happened. And when you sue people that somebody else got the job with lower qualification, it's really difficult to prove. But there is also a formal social closure mechanism, like based on educational credentials or membership in professional associations. And this is something which was researched by Randall Collins. Social closure theory is based on scatter comments from Weber's Economy and Society, but he never developed a full theory of it. It was later on that Frank Parkin and Raymond Murphy developed a full-blown theory of social closure, and it proved to be really, really important for us, and it enabled us to study these mechanisms. What is, I think, crucial for understanding this hybrid character of these societies is that these mechanisms overlap, they are intertwined, they cannot be analytically isolated, they cannot be reduced to common foundation. So this occupational class analysis has very limited exploratory power. I mean, even the labor market in these societies does not function in accordance with economic principle. You got a job, but not because you're qualified for it, but because you're a party member. Your company is really successful in gaining all these tenders, but it is not because it's a good company, but they have a link to the dominant party and so on. So it's not possible to simply group engineers on one side, industrial workers on the other, general practitioners on the third side, and so on. It will give you formally good results, but it won't tell you anything about inequalities in these societies. I can tell you more about these weaknesses of occupational class analysis later on, but I don't have the time to stay a long period on this. So our decision is, so you cannot separate these influences, they're intertwined. So what you can do, you can measure the result. You can measure general social inequality or generalized social advantage, disadvantage. And we define general social inequality as inequality in social powers, measured by indicators of economic, political, social, and cultural capital. It's basically idea of Bertrand Russell. He claimed that what is energy for natural sciences, power can be for social sciences and can be a basis for unification of social sciences. And this is the idea that Pierre Bourdieu took. And these economic, political, social, cultural capital, these are just different forms of power, as we know. So when we want to analyze class condition, we analyze inequality in social powers. It's important to realize that it's not inequality in social power, singular. It's inequality in different sorts of social powers, plurals. And then when you analyze class position of a certain class, you see, you should analyze position of individuals and groups in all unequal relationships they find themselves in. And I will speak more about later on about difference between class condition and class position, which is really important for the Bourdieusian type of analysis. So class position is where you are in exploitative market mechanisms and mechanisms of social closure. So based on this, our research passed through 4 steps in creation of the model. First, we analyze how these inequality generating mechanisms work. In the second phase, we constructed social space in Serbia using indicators of economic, political, social, and cultural capital. And this is what Bourdieu defines as logical classes, classes on paper or constructed classes. But we wanted to study, can these classes be more than just statistical constructs? And we use for this purpose traditions of Michelle Lamont and her associates, and in the final step of Cambridge stratification group. So we studied whether between these clusters exist symbolic boundaries, which could be expressed through evaluation of others' lifestyles. And finally, we researched the fourth step. The third step is already present in Bourdieu. This is the role of lifestyles in distinction. In social space, there are no inherent social boundaries. So all 3 axes along which social space is constructed, they are continuous. So basically establishing classes in real life, this is the role that the first stage belongs to lifestyles. You by evaluating other lifestyles, you basically establish a sort of primitive classification, and it builds on after that until you reach the level of social classes. But we added the 4th step, which we think is even more important, is differential association. This refers to the fact that people who are socially similar, it's more likely that they will be acquaintances, friends, and they will become married. So we tested whether those respondents who belong to these clusters, whether they do make friends and do get married with people from other clusters or not, to see whether social boundaries between these classes are established. In this step 2, as I mentioned, we constructed social space in Serbia, but in addition to economic and cultural capital that Bourdieu uses, we also use indicators of political and social capital, which are important capitals for post-socialist societies. But once you add these variables of political and social capital to economic and cultural capital, social space changes dramatically. It doesn't remain the same as it is in Bourdieu or Bourdieusian studies. It becomes a very complex jigsaw puzzle, which consists of regions, which are defined by different combinations of capitals, and a key resource, which is usually the one which determines practices. So the main axis of differentiation remains the total volume of capital, as you can see it here, but the principle of composition of capital changes dramatically. So you can see in this MCA map that in the upper part of the map, you have indicators of high political capital, the respondent hold a managerial or executive role, high respondents' education, high education of their mothers. But you can also, and at the bottom, you have low indicators of all these capitals, but you also have a differentiation between on the left, in the upper left quadrant, you have more indicators of cultural capital and higher earnings. And on the right side of the upper right quadrant, or on the upper right quadrant, you have indicators of informal connections, political membership, parties, lower income but higher possessions, because they can use these informal networks to achieve what people who simply earn their salaries cannot. And on the bottom, on the lower parts of the social space, you have on the left side, those who have developed skills. And on the right-hand side, you have those whose key resource is arable land. Then we conducted hierarchical class analysis, and we got these 6 clusters. Those clusters which belong to the lower part of social space, we call them capital poor class. Those who belong to the upper part, we call them class with average capitals. And we have 3 different clusters which belong to capital poor class, which you call precarious cluster, agrarian cluster, and manual and service cluster. And we have two clusters in the upper part of the space, which we called capital class with average capitals culture cluster and class with average capital social cluster. And in the middle, we have this intermediary class, which basically does not have its own space, but overlaps with all other clusters. And we also, I mean, in our survey, there was no individuals belonging to capital rich cluster, the dominant class, and it's not something that it's unusual. They are very few, and also they refuse to participate in these surveys, but we studied them using other methods like desk research, social network analysis, interviews, and we realized that it's composed basically of two fractions, political and economic. The capital rich class political fraction consists of major leaders of major political parties and members of top echelons of military, police, and church hierarchies. Their key resource is political capital. And capital rich class economic fractions is more diverse. It consists of post-socialist tycoons, then branch managers of multinational companies and banks, celebrities, entertainers, and sports stars, especially those who play abroad, and those who are called controversial businessmen, which are in fact criminals. And what was really important, as I mentioned, to study whether these are just statistical constructs. So in the third step, we studied whether there are symbolic boundaries, and we relied on dictum by Michel Armand that symbolic boundaries are necessary but insufficient precondition for establishing social boundaries. So when it comes to the test of symbolic boundaries, we created a field of lifestyles. We use indicators of culture and material consumption following the tradition started by Veblen and Weber. But we also added these indicators of value orientations because they are the foundation on which both cultural and material consumption is based. The other foundation is, of course, financial. And we got these 6 clusters again, which we called old style traditionalists, turbo folk traditionalists, secular survivors. Then on the upper part of the field of lifestyles, of affluent conservatives, alternative seekers, and conformist consumers. What is important to see is that this field of lifestyles is organized along 2 axes. One, which refers to the level of cultural and material consumption. This is the vertical one. And the horizontal one, which makes a division according to value orientations. On the left side, you have those who are traditional and religious. And on the left side, you have those who are modern and secular. So although there are differences in material and cultural consumption between alternative seekers and secular survivors, they share the same value orientation. And it's important for the classes as well. On the right side, you have that affluent conservatives, old-style traditionalists, and turbo folk traditionalists. They also share the same value orientations, and this can explain voting over class boundaries. What we did next is to project center points of both class clusters and lifestyle clusters, and you can see that there is a clear division between those who belong to upper part of the social space and lower parts of social space. But it's not one-on-one like Bourdieu thought. It is not that each class and each class fraction has its own habitus and its own lifestyle, but it's more like 3-on-3. So in the upper part of social space, you have lifestyles of alternative seekers, affluent conservatives, and conformist consumers. And on the bottom of social space, you have those who belong to secular survivors, old-style traditionalists, and turbo folk traditionalists. And you can see it even in this simple cross-tabulation. For example, cluster of turbo folk traditionalists, 80% of them belong to one of these capital poor classes. Or the other way around, if you want to look at the capital poor precarious, 91% of them belong to one of the first 3 lifestyles. Or for example, capital class with average capitals cultural, then 87% of them can be found in lifestyles 4, 5, and 6. So there is a clear symbolic boundaries between 2 classes, between those who belong to capital poor class on one side and class with average capitals and intermediary class. And in the 4th step, we, as I mentioned, we tested whether these people got friends and marital partners along this lines, or they just don't do it. They cross these lines, but it turned out that it's very similar to symbolic boundaries. For example, we did it for 3 best friends and for spouses. And for example, those who belong to capital poor class precarious, they have almost 6 times more chances to be married, to have friends with somebody who has elementary education. And for those who belong to class with average capitals cultural, they have 12 times more chances to have friends who have a university education. And the same thing for spouses, and very similar to occupations. So basically you can say that there are symbolic and social boundaries between these groups. And this is probably the most important thing at the end, that we have, in this case, overlaps between constructed classes based on indicators of capitals and practical social divisions, practical classifications by the agents themselves. So it's not just, these are not just statistical constructs. These are not social classes, especially not social classes in Marxist sense, like combatant groups who share the same condition of life and ideology, but these are much more than just statistical constructs. And we need a name for this class, and we would propose to call it existential class, because it is based on similar existential conditions. And it is also not based only on their occupation. And this is what we got. I don't have time to explain it now, but I would be glad to do it when the discussion comes. And the second part relates to these cultural wars in Serbia. These are collective cleavages that I mentioned at the beginning. It's really related usually to the book by James Davison Hunter called Cultural Wars in America. And he defines cultural war as a struggle to achieve and maintain the power to define reality. He says that I define cultural conflict as a political and social hostility rooted in different systems of moral understanding. The end to which these hostilities tend is domination of one culture and moral ethos over all others. And in this sense, it's close to hegemony of Gramsci. And anyway, Gramsci is probably the only theoretician which is constantly quoted in the book on cultural wars in America. Something which is really also important is that common sense is the crucial side of this ideological conflict. So it's not related just to intellectuals and so on. It's going on constantly, and everybody is trying to impose their own worldview as the dominant one. And it's, despite all the differences, it's close to classification struggles that Bourdieu speaks about. They are ultimately waged in order to impose one own system of classification as the dominant one. In Serbia, these drastic changes that Serbia passed through from the 90s were accompanied by these intense symbolic struggles. Especially in the 90s, the key one was between those who belong to patriotic bloc on one side. They are labeled by their opponents as nationalists or fascists. And on the other side, cosmopolitan and anti-war activists on the other. They are usually called the other or second Serbia and labeled by their opponents as traitors or also chauvinists. And also there are other cultural wars and other symbolic struggles on several additional symbolic battlefields. One of them is the long Orientalist line between those who are perceived to belong to European north of the country, in contrast to those who belong to Oriental South. Then between the urban and recently urbanized groups, especially related to rapid urbanization after the Second World War, and there was another symbolic division between the educated and uneducated, but today is between those who belong to scientifically minded Enlightenment pole and all these conspiracy theorists and those, we call them anti-Enlightenment pole, anti-vaxxers, flat earthers, anti-evolutionists and fundamental religionists and so on. I will focus just on two pseudo-territorial divisions. And The first one on patriots or nationalists, this is what cosmopolitans tell of them. This brand of patriotism cannot exist within the enemy, without traitors. The harm these bad and heterogeneous companies where PhDs stand shoulder to shoulder with Serbian Orthodox Church bishops, war and post-war criminals, bounders, rogues and uttermost criminals inflict on the nation is immeasurable and multifaceted. Or patriots, what they say on cosmopolitans. They call them auto-chauvinists, somebody who hates their own nation. The basis of auto-chauvinism in Serbia is provincial complex, a feeling of inferiority, an attempt to prove you belong to the world. I honestly feel sorry for Serbian auto-chauvinists. The world wanted nothing to do with them, and they knew it. Or once we have liberated ourselves, and very funny, nationalists always connect communism with people who belong to this other Serbia or these cosmopolitans as communism, and these other Serbia turrets must be crushed through law, through the system, so that we wipe them off the face of earth for good. And there are plenty of these direct accusations and quarrels, but very often this is couched in terms of advantages of local versus global culture. And in one of my previous articles, we hypothesized that in societies that were at some point westernized, either through colonization like India, China, Indonesia, Mexico, and so on, or through activities of their own elites like Serbia, Romania, Russia, Turkey, there is a constant tension and struggle between local and global culture for the status of legitimate culture. So it's not like in France that there is one hierarchy and that different groups struggle to achieve the status of the legitimate culture. No, you have two hierarchies here, local and global culture, and accordingly you have two types of cultural capital, local and culture capital and global culture capital. Sorry. And I try to locate some of the basic characteristics of these local and global culture. Unfortunately, no time to go through them. I can just stop for a few minutes so that for a few seconds so that you can look through it. And the important thing is to notice that local doesn't necessarily mean low. Local can be elite as well, as I will try to show you. And global doesn't mean cosmopolitan. Global can be quite exclusive, those for global culture. They can be quite exclusive. Okay, I hope these examples will make it clear that the field of cultural participation in Serbia is organized along two lines. The most important one, which is global culture versus local culture. And the second axis is contemporary versus traditional culture. So in crossing between these two main lines, we have these four, let's say, pure and four eclectic, and three eclectic types of cultural practices that we call omnivores, elite omnivores, conformist omnivores, and rural omnivores. And now I have some quotes from our research on culture war in Serbia. For example, expert in social sciences says, I really disliked all that stuff that play on pink television, that folk music, which is total trash, the most awful garbage, right? It just grates me on, it irritates me, gives me a headache. To me, it embodies our entire state of affairs in a way. It's interesting, I'm neither familiar with the lyrics, not with who's singing, yet when I hear it, I can immediately see the entire situation we are living in, which is rather catastrophic, and it irritates me even more. Or the manager of the regional office of a foreign bank, I have a big problem. I want to be tolerant in a lot of things. When it comes to music, I'm really, really harsh. Lately, I've been able to control myself even, but if you listen to folk music, you and I have nothing to talk about. We simply don't. Or music teacher who says that some of them are more educated than I am, but I still think that those who listen to folk music, they are idiots. What is particular for Serbia, at least, that the symbolic violence theory doesn't work here. In here, the abhorrence and hatred go both ways. So you have a male restaurant owner who says that I dislike rock the most because it causes me to produce extra testosterone. I'm ready to kick off. It bothers me. It muddles my mind. Just like a strobo light causes an anxiety, that's what rock causes in me. Junkies like rock. That might be another reason why I have a problem with it. The people who listen to rock write grungy, greasy, stone cook-up, and so on. Or a military person who said that classical concert music that I cannot stand. For example, I couldn't watch musicals either. Or a nice granny who likes opera. She said, I listen to classical music and my son and daughter-in-law don't. And once I played opera to Angela, my granddaughter, and my son told me, Grandma, don't teach the kid this nonsense. So this was this division between local and global. And when you need to recognize each other as member of the same class, it plays a really huge role. And the second, and I will end with this, is division along this Oriental line. There is this very interesting article by Milica Bakić-Hajden called Nesting Orientalism, the case of former Yugoslavia. She claims that this original dichotomy East-West by Edward Said tends to replicate itself constantly. So for example, people who live in East Europe, they are more West than those who live in Asia. People who live in East Europe, they are less West than those who live in West Europe, but they are more West than those who live in the Balkans. And therefore states in the Balkans, there are those states which are more West and which are more Oriental or East. And within the same single country, for example, in Yugoslavia, there were parts which were considered to be more European, Slovenia and Croatia, and more Oriental, the rest of Yugoslavia. The funny thing is that once Yugoslavia was gone and now we have Serbia, in Serbia, these division between Oriental and European reappeared. So we have North Vojvodina, which was once part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's now European part, and the south of Serbia is more Oriental part. The important thing is that these characteristics, pseudo-territorial, are later on essentialized, and they are used as an arch principle explaining practices. So you claim they do this because they are Oriental, they are like Turks, or they do this because they are Austro-Hungarians. And we did a lot of interviews, and these interviews were, our interviews were glad to just expose all these stereotypes. For example, one of them, who is from Novi Sad, he said that, have you ever been to the South and what your impressions? You know, my impression is that the people there are very nice, but overall it's a total backward ghetto. I'm being perfectly frank here, both in terms of hygiene and the level of education. These people cannot talk, I don't mean cases in dialects, I mean these people can fucking talk. So I was really disappointed, and I had realized that the extent of people living in such a poverty so primitively, it really came as a shock to me. Or a person from Belgrade says, shall we do some ranking? Belgrade 10, Vojvodina 8, the south of Serbia 1. And when our interviewer asked, what do you mean 1? 1 is backwardness, culturally, financially, educational. Southerners are 100% Turks. Turkism has a huge influence on them, and they're just so stuck. Another person from Belgrade, highly educated, that people from Vojvodina, there is a very strong Austro-Hungarian influence there. The influence of an orderly system and society that has simply accepted this from one generation to another. They are more cultivated, more obedient. And what about Southerners? I don't know that much about them, but they are said to be temperamental. And another person from Belgrade said, what your opinion about people from Vojvodina? I don't know much about there, but they are too blinkered, too sluggish. They were not hospitable. And how about people from South Serbia? They're exactly opposite. What do you mean by that? Friendly. They are totally welcome you, as they know their own whole life. And somebody from South Serbia, what do you mean? Is there an association when somebody says Southerners? Well, there might be. It might be this dialect. Maybe it's like this. Although we are weaker economically, but we have a heart, bro. We have a soul. That's what we have. We are warmer. And finally, we have some smart respondents who say that this is basically rubbish. It's like that they're being robotized, they've been chipped. Well, I'm from Vojvodina, I'm such and such, and I'm from South and such. So there are these classifications. People really believe this. So it does exist, and it creates a certain antagonism between North and South. And it's also class-based and political. And yeah, it's really a disaster, if you ask me. So finally, the last slide. On one hand, in the age of globalization, there is an obvious need to overcome methodological nationalism. With my colleagues from Croatia, and other colleagues will join us soon, we study 4 societies in Southeast Europe, from former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia. And we can see how these symbolic divisions, how these collective symbolic cleavages differ between these societies. And we are now participating in a project which will enable us to study social inequalities in Europe. But so on one hand, you have to overcome methodological nationalism. On the other hand, you cannot do it in the same way that economy is doing it. Because you cannot deterritorialize sociology in the same way, exactly for the huge role that symbolic plays in this. But you can unpack and analyze this, naturalize the seemingly well-known meanings of territorial symbolic divisions. For example, local culture can mean different things. It can mean our own Serbian culture, and then it's opposed to Oriental culture. But it can mean, local can mean Balkan culture, and then it's opposed to Western culture. But it also can mean Slavic culture and can be opposed to non-Slavic cultures. So you need to do it, but you cannot do it using just quantitative data. You need qualitative research for this. These are the data or the project, these are the projects that we use our data from. And what is particularly important, what I presented is really a result of a teamwork. So I'm proud to present members of our class team, Inga Tomić-Kuludrović from Split, Croatia, Mirko Petrić, both from the Institute of Social Sciences, from Ivo Pilar from Split, Željka Zdraković from the University of Zadar, Croatia, and Adrian Linguina from Loughborough University, UK. And there is another team which worked with me on cultural wars, includes Ana Fotev, Ratko Nikolić, and Vuk Dinić, all of them from our Center for Empirical Cultural Studies. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Predrag, for a highly stimulating talk. I can see some hands going up already, so I shall. Maybe I can slightly abuse my position and ask the first question, and then I shall hand over to some of the other hands, the others who put their hands up. So I was just one question I'd like to ask to start off with is I really found it useful and interesting that your focus, your emphasis on social capital, the significance of social capital. Firstly, a kind of technical question, I suppose. When you're looking at those who are more at with the global side of things, did the social capital extend beyond borders and so on? What was the sort of international dimension of the social capital? Secondly, I was thinking, wondering whether in your studies of other countries, whether you think that this is particular to Serbia, or do you think that other studies of class and culture are missing out on this? I mean, when I think of Britain, there's a lot of emphasis on culture and economic capital in the studies, but when you think of, the fact that we've had 20 odd prime ministers who went to the same school, that, social capital studies, I think it's neglected in the UK. So I'd wondered if you had any reflections on the uniqueness of Serbia there, or whether social capital you think is, this is a neglected element in other contexts.
For us, it was really liberating when we read the article by Bourdieu on that in different societies there are different principles of differentiation. So for us it was okay, so we don't have to use only economic and cultural capital, just reproduce his studies. The thing is that for each society then you have to study what are the main principles of differentiation. And for Serbia, definitely these are political capital and social capital, in addition to economic capital now, is a very important one. But in most of these societies in Southeast Europe as well, the thing is that my colleague has an interesting explanation of the brain drain in Serbia and the region. These are people with high cultural capital, but low level of social capital. They are usually not members of political parties and so on. So they leave, they go abroad where the cultural capital will be more valuable. And I think that basically, I think that social capital is underrated everywhere. And the example that you mentioned from Britain, it's clear, but people tend to replicate what Bourdieu did and not to replicate his approach to studies. So I think that definitely it will be useful to include these indicators of political social capital everywhere. But the thing is that it changes, then social space changes a lot. You have to analyze it differently. It's not possible to see it as simple division between high volume, low volume, and like different combination of economic and political capital, more economic, less capital, and so on. So the thing is, in each case, you need to analyze what are the main powers in these societies and then include them in the analysis. And I would like to see this in other societies, but I can really claim only about these 4 that we are studying at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. So any hands up? Some hands did go up, but they may have been applause, hands of applause, claps. But I can see Vivara and Sophia, is there anything in the chat?
Yes, we do have a question in the chat coming from Joost. Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, please do.
All right. I really enjoyed this paper. It was extremely thoroughly and well supported by evidence, as well as clarity of argumentation. One thing I wanted to ask is simply, your reference to culture wars seemed to have ended up with a resonance of Orientalism repeating itself in smaller territorializations. However, it felt to me that the American version of culture wars does not apply very well to this territorial division. Perhaps you would consider to engage a bit more with the concept of racism when considering the territorial anchoring of such antagonisms. And that came from Joost.
Yes, thank you, Joost. The thing is that I thought that I was clear that both of these examples, local global culture, which is an example of these 2 blocks, patriots or fascists on one side, and cosmopolitans or auto-chauvinists on the other side, it also refers to cultural wars. And in our case, it's not racism, which is important, but ethnicity and religion. And it goes there. I mean, it's present. But the thing is that the brutal consequence of this lunacy in the 90s, that most of these countries are now, except Bosnia, for example, and Macedonia, they're ethnically clean. Unfortunately, there are like 3% of minorities in Serbia, and before it was like 30. So in this case, these are cultural wars of Serbs between Serbs, Serbs against Serbs, on these different 4 lines that I can repeat, like those who are patriots against cosmopolitans, those who are educated against those who are uneducated, those who are urbanized against those who are urban against those who are recently urbanized, and finally those who are Oriental against those who are European. So there are in Hunter, this is the war between those who are Orthodox and those who are liberal progressivists. But in Serbia, there are many lines of conflict. And you cannot just unite them under one heading. And we try to follow them all, but I was not able to present all of them. Although I have excellent examples, for example, that my colleagues did using data scraping of Twitter accounts, but maybe for the next time.
Hey, thank you. We've got a question from Jukka.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Predrag. It was very, very interesting and extremely important results you have in many ways. I think very rich presentation and studies. I have I'm afraid, quite a big and principal question about, as you know, there's been a lot of talk in post-socialist, especially among historians of post-socialist countries, modern Eastern European countries, about the so-called path dependency of these countries, that they are somehow some of the remnants of the socialist past, or even previous past, are very much to be blamed for, which are often associated as negative features in these countries, like corruption and so forth. I mean, the impact of as you like, as you would say, political and social capital in economic relations, for instance, which then are somehow adapted and reproduced under the modern conditions of market top pseudo market economy, whatever it is. It would be interesting to know your opinion. To what extent that kind of, how much can we rely on the explanations of that kind of a continuity or remnants of the past, or is this something that is simply produced under the new conditions of this hybrid economic political relations in these countries, probably more even might be closer to the so-called third world countries or something like that than the socialist past.
Yes, thank you very much. This is what I this is what I mentioned at the beginning. The situation partly derives from socialism, so it is partly dependent in a way, but it really worsened with these neoliberal tendencies. So in a way, we live in a world which is the worst possible combination of real socialism and neoliberalism. So it was in comparison to socialism, all this party domination is more exaggerated, is more present. In socialist times, as I mentioned, those who wanted to be in executive positions or managerial positions, in Yugoslavia at least, they need to be members of the party. But everybody else no. And also, I mean, if you want to be in a managerial position, you didn't go to church, you were not a believer, but everybody else could. But now, political parties are the main source, the main channel through which you get your posts, for which you get like opportunities to get promoted or even get medical services or scholarships and so on. So in a way, you can say that, for example, in Serbia, in order to be exploited, you first need to pass through filters of social closure. So in a way, it's much worse than it was in socialism. So there are elements of socialism there, but they get worse in these last 30 years. And it's not just Serbia, we see it in other countries of the region as well.
Okay, and we've got another, any more questions in the chat? I think there is one. Am I right, Sophia?
Yes, at the moment we have a question in the chat and a comment in the chat. Would you like me to read those?
Yes, please.
All right, so coming from Annette, we have a recommendation of a study. She said, exactly, a study analyzing the power in Denmark has used the social networks across what you would normally consider capitals has been conducted and shows surprising connections between people for very powerful, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm not reading very well. This lovely study done in Denmark shows an example of very powerful people from the unions and the very upper classes, the royal family even. Network connections exhibited through network connections, and they map this very clearly. And she directs us to the sociologist Kristen Human Elsgaard and Anton Grau Larsen. And apparently this was from a PhD project. So if anybody's interested in that, check that out. And then we have a question from Jingwei, who says, also known as Stella, thank you for sharing. This presentation inspired them a lot. As you said, there may be two ways for countries at some point in history to be westernized for these elites. How do you define them? In your hypothesis, does the elite's activity result from individuals' actions or through the government?
Yes, thank you very much. For the first comment, we know Christoph and Anton. We are members of this CAD group, and basically we followed their methodology when we analyzed capital-rich class in Serbia. And for this question about China, the thing is that some of these countries were westernized by their elites, like Turkey or Russia, Serbia as well. And I guess that it was, on one hand, it was intention of the government to westernize, as it was then told. They speak about this as modernize. And on the other hand, there are plenty of individuals who studied, for example, for Serbia, especially in France. And many of them brought experiences from France to Serbia. But the point is that there was always this tension between local culture and foreign culture, as they call it. at the time, but now it turns into a distinction between local and global culture. And maybe I can explain what I mean by local global. It means global forms. So people who play sonic youth in Serbia, they are still global. And you have these hybrid forms like turbo folk, which is mainly Serbian product. It's called differently in different countries in the region, and it's popular in Bulgaria, for example, very much. And as we heard yesterday, in Croatia as well. But these are Balkan in a way. These are Balkan cultural forms. So this tension is constantly there, and sometimes it results in oppositions. But both Bourdieu and Herbert Gans claim that these disputes about taste are much more serious than it looks like. It really, what it means really is which culture and whose culture should dominate society. And this is how it is connected to Gramsci, and this is how it is connected to Hunter, and so on.
Thank you. So we've still got some time for some more questions while I'm looking to see if any other hands are up. I've got another one I was going to ask, which is again about the specificness of Serbia. And I'm fascinated to hear more about well, two things really. One, I'd like to hear a bit more about the high status local culture in Serbia. What is that, and how does that play out? And secondly, I'd just be intrigued to hear a bit more about folk, because some, as you say, some of that anger, some of that vitriol about folk music as being the lowest of the low. But on the other hand, you've got the trumpet festival, haven't you, in Serbia, which has become a globally hit kind of festival and been seen as a place to go to have a party for people around the world. It's a cosmopolitan tourist destination, if you like, based on a type of folk music, I suppose. So they're my two questions.
When it comes to local culture, there are examples of medieval music, both spiritual and like those which is not, and they are recycled, and there are bands or individuals who sing this music, and they are treated as an elite form of a music. For example, for those who are familiar with work of Jan Garbarek and Ernest Garnes, in Norwegian, this is the type of mixture that they use. Some famous jazz musicians or classical musicians, they use these local chants or play them in original. But when it comes to hatred, in 1990s, one of the key divisions are between those who listen to rock music, classical music, jazz, and on the other hand, turbo folk. But it was not about music. For those who have a global culture capital, for them it was clear that it becomes the dominance of the local culture capital. Some other culture is becoming dominant, and basically our capital is become worthless. Education, I mean, one of the things I mentioned, that culture capital is losing its strength in Serbia. It's very much connected with the it's mushrooming of private universities of very dubious quality. So, for example, we got the data that in the last 10 years, there are 880% increase of PhDs in Serbia in the last 10 years, which devaluates education completely and makes the value of cultural capital very low. So it's not about the music at all. This is what one of the examples says. It reminds me of the situation that I live in, and then this music irritates me even more.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of minutes left, but I see we've got two questions. We've got Simon has got his hand up. Another Simon here.
Sorry, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. It was really, really interesting. So I was kind of wondering if you could develop slightly the links between the cultural capital and the political capital aspects. And I was particularly interested in obviously the turbo folk aspect, and if they had any links to libertarian politics by any chance, was a question I was wondering. Just because by I guess I found libertarian politicians who've written books about libertarianism who also play in bands, and one of the bands is actually called Turbo Satan, which is like kind of American folk music, which is kind of zooped up and kind of similar. So I'd be interested in that. There we go. Thank you very much.
Okay. In Serbia, in contrast to France, intellectuals are not members of the dominant class. They can be members of the dominant class only if they are party members or they are party leaders. So cultural capital basically is, in socialism, it was treated as the main oppositional capital. And we have these dissidents who were, they were not treated like in other countries of Eastern Europe, but they were not able to teach, for example, this sort of stuff, but they are, in a way, they have a high prestige. Today, this prestige is lost. You have cultural capital like a simple resource related to knowledge economy, but political capital basically dominates. And libertarian tradition is quite unusual in Serbia. You do have liberal tradition in like more American sense of socio-democratic tradition, but libertarian is you do have some libertarian parties and associations, but this is really a minority, which is not really worth mentioning. It's basically a collectivist country, is many in aspects. It's egalitarian country, and it's especially egalitarian in a sense, we really don't matter how rich you are, but don't pretend that you're better than we are. So there is also this twist in Bourdieu's theory. Those who rule in France, they rule because they are better kind of persons. It can be shown in their taste as well. They are more refined and so on. In Serbia, those who rule claim that they rule because they are the same as the people. These are populist strategies which are present here, I think, for 200 years. So we are richer, but we are the same. We listen to the same type of music. We eat the same type of food. This is one of the things, how they advertise themselves.
Thank you. So I think we've just got a minute or so left. I can see, Sophia, do you mind, or Vavara, reading out the last couple of questions from the chat? I see there are some.
Yes, no problem. We have gotten a couple of questions in the chat, or one more from Luca. Thank you. Really enjoyed the presentation. Would you say perhaps that these different social cleavages in nowadays Serbia fall along the lines of modernization, both in the sense of geographical divisions and generational transmissions of cultural capital? And if so, to what degree?
And then actually, you wanted to read out the last couple of questions as well, and then perhaps Predrag can deal with them all in one hit as we're nearly.
Yes, this is what I'm waiting for.
No problem. There was also one that came in from Alessandra, which says, thank you for the presentation. I would like to clarify the term. I saw, for example, in the British Journal of Sociology that they do not recommend the use of this term. Hopefully you know which term she's talking about. I guess
hybrid.
It's the term hybrid.
Oh yeah, yes. And sorry to interject one other question that's just come through. Actually, sorry, no, it's okay. I'll let you leave you to answer those.
Okay, for Luca, I mean, these so different social cleavages and symbolic cleavages. Some of them are just really quite there for a long time. There are those who claim that these division between first Serbia and second Serbia, patriots and cosmopolitans, really can be dated down to the 13th century when the first Serbian kings were crowned by the Pope. And later on, they were recrowned by the Byzantine Empire. So there were those who supported European links of Serbia and those who supported Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine. So some of them are quite, they are present for centuries, but then for political reasons, they got activated. These collective symbolic cleavages are there, but in particular political situation they got activated and for different purposes. And for British Journal of Sociology, we just submitted the article about this to British Journal of Sociology, so we will see what their decision is. And hybridity is there is in many aspects for us. Hybrid means that social inequalities are generated by several mechanisms of similar strength. So you cannot rely on usual occupational class analysis.
Just one final point. We had a good comment from Peter about that referred to the point I made earlier about social capital, and he's referring to the chumocracy, a form of kleptocracy in the UK, where government contracts are handed out to pals and Tory party donors.
Yes, yes.
So unless anyone else has any questions, I think we're out of time. So I'd like to very much, on behalf of everybody here, extend a huge thanks to Predrag for such a really stimulating conversation. It's given us lots to think about. So thank you very much, Predrag, once again, on behalf of all of us.
Thank you very much. It was really, I mean, I like these questions very much.
Thank you. And just one more reminder to everyone that we can, the lunch room is now open. So so some of you may wish to go there for an informal chat. Thanks all.
Bye.
Right, I'm going to close the room now. So thank you all very much. And I hope that to see lots of you over in the lunchroom.